Welcome to the Deconstructed Woman podcast, a podcast about breaking down barriers between women, exploring and sharing perspectives of each individual woman's experience, and discovering what we have in common and what makes us different. Hosted by Elisa Marie and Joji.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of The Deconstructed Woman. This is Joji, and I've got Alyssa Murray here with me. And today we're going to be talking about all the different things that influence our children. And as parents, how much control do we have over that? This occurred to me when I was at a dance recital, and I saw a dance recital probably with a new set of eyes. And what I saw was probably 25 different acts, and a handful of them were making me uncomfortable. There were a dance recital with, I'd say, 3 and 4 year olds, little boys and little girls, and they were dancing to a song about the boy courting the girl and how the girls were responding to that via dance. There were 2 modern dances with older girls, probably, I would say, 8th grade, 9th graders, doing very much of a modern dance, but in certain ways, in my opinion, somewhat sexualized. And so it made me uncomfortable and sort of conflicted in terms of seeing that and trying to respect the art form, but at the same time, seeing it now with children, whether they were little or older, sort of playing out this repeating pattern of, either sexualizing girls or projecting onto very young children sort of roles, whether it's the male courting the girl being cutesy with the boy or responding to the boy. And a couple of us after the performance sort of talked about it. And I think we were all women, we were all in our 50s, and we all agreed that it made us uncomfortable, but yet we didn't really know what you could do about that, because obviously dance takes many forms, and there were lots of great things in that dance studio who was putting on this recital, but just this 2 or 3 performances really were sort of off-putting somewhat. So I wanted to bring this conversation up, and I ran it by Alyssa, and wanted her impressions of this, not only in dance, but other things as well. And so, Alyssa, what comes up for you when I was talking about what I observed and how I was conflicted about what I saw?
I think that the first thing that I thought about was just how has this played out in my experience with my own children. And I didn't really see a lot of it as far as, 'cause I mean, my kids mainly play sports. And so I don't see as much of kind of that, maybe, sexualized things. I didn't really see a lot of that. But then it got me thinking about, well, how have they been influenced in other ways? So we had started talking about, I had mentioned that when my daughter was, I think it was in first grade, because they were definitely in school. She did kindergarten remotely. But in first grade, she had come home and she had said to me something to the extent of, Mom, I really don't know what to do because I like this little boy and this little boy, but I don't know who's going to be my boyfriend. And so we had to have a very quick conversation about, we don't have boyfriends in first grade. We have friends, and they can be, girls or boys. We just, everybody's friends. There's no necessarily like requirement for you to have one specific boyfriend. And that was, highly influenced by her peers, because that's not something that we discuss in our household. And so that kind of got the conversation going of the fact that children these days are influenced by a lot of things, but also that it's kind of changed over the years. We've definitely seen, or at least for me, I put on TV shows that are kind of nostalgic for me. And I'm like, oh, I watched this as a kid, and I'm watching it. I'm like, oh, this is not really not appropriate for my kids, even though I watched it when I was the same age as them. And so, there's kind of been this shift and this change in the media. And then also, I think that there's a lot of influences on our children that we kind of have to consider, but also kind of looking at how, did that damage me as a child? Not really. I mean, I don't know. I can't really speak to, what kind of influences it may or may not have had, but I feel like, me watching those television shows as a kid didn't necessarily throw me into a negative trajectory. And so are we overly protecting our kids from influences or not? I mean, I think that's probably one of the questions on the table as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we did. I mean, now when I look back at what we did watch, and what our parents maybe because they weren't aware of what we were watching or how things were going to turn out, I think I think there's a certain amount of I think hope from our parents when they let us watch TV or didn't regulate what we watched, that a lot of it would go over our heads, and maybe a lot of it did go over our heads. I can't think of like a direct impact from me watching something and saying, oh, I'm going to do this and I'm going to try it. But I don't know if that's also because what we watched was so maybe not something we had access to, right? And so maybe it was more fantasy. I do know that developmentally, like kids don't necessarily understand death or, like permanency of things like that until around 10 or 11. And so some of the things that I think little kids watch that we are really worried about, maybe something that they don't understand because of that lack of understanding about permanence or death. And so maybe there is something to be said for not being like hyper vigilant about what they watch because maybe it won't occur to them the same way we think it's going to that the way it impacts us because we're adults and we've passed through those things. What do you think about that? I mean, you've got three little ones at home, different ages. Do you feel like there is a difference in their ability to absorb it or understand it differently amongst their different ages? I know you don't have a 10, 11-year-old yet, but what are the differences that you see between your 8-year-old, your 6-year-old, and we'll leave your little one out of the conversation, but how about between your older two?
Yeah, I mean, I think you brought up a good point that I didn't really think about because, again, I'm watching these TV shows as an adult and they seem so inappropriate. But again, that's because I'm viewing them through the eyes of an adult. And I think that a child sees it as funny and slapstick and like entertaining in a way that I mean, I don't, I'd have to look at it from the viewpoint of a child. So I think in that regard, that's probably very accurate. I think that a lot of times, um, I don't know. I think it's hard. I would say like my children are very different. So I'm kind of slowly introducing them into some of the movies that are some of my favorite movies, and it's very interesting to see the two of them and how they react and respond differently. So we started to watch the Harry Potter series, and at first they were a little tentative and like this is kind of scary, and then now they watch them with really no reservation. They've kind of gone through the whole series. They know how it ends. They kind of know where things are going to happen. And so the predictability of the movie actually eased their fears, which I thought was an interesting kind of, you know, progression with them. And so I was like, I don't know, can we ease into some of the other movies that, are really meaningful to me and that we can read the book and then go through that. And so that's been kind of, some of the experimentation to see where their limits lie. And if they're saying to me like, no, that's too scary, I can't watch that, then then we discuss, okay, we're not going to watch that now, we'll wait a couple years and come back to it. So I think that I kind of go by gauging like how they respond to it, but I definitely also, which I know didn't happen when I was a kid, is I talk through it with them and kind of like we'll watch maybe a half hour 40 minutes of a movie and then we'll kind of debrief afterwards, like how did that, what did you think of that, was that too much? And again, I'm talking like PG and PG-13 at the most because they're rather small, but even those I kind of have to debrief with them because some of them can bring up stuff, but again, things that I thought were quite scary, they did not. So I think that the different child's perspective really does carry into it.
Yeah, I think that too. When you were talking, I was thinking about, well, how many, like, what did we watch at home? And I really feel like under the age of 10, I think, I felt like my daughter's influences probably were her friends and if they had siblings, and how much older those siblings were than the kids in her circle. And so I mean, Neela was an only child, and so she really did not have a lot of familiarity with having kids above you or under you. And we got ourselves into quite some pickles because of that. But, if the older kids had siblings that might be, on their phones or on social media or, were would throw around the language of going on a date or having a boyfriend. Those were things that then was a new conversation that Neela, I think, would come and try out at home, or she would sort of throw it out there and see what my reaction would be. And I think, when you talk about what can you control for, I think as much as we try to buffer our kids from some of these influences on them, there are things that are a natural part of growing up that unless you were going to micromanage your children's social environment, there's really no way that you can prevent that from happening. I was even thinking about, if I was this mom who had a child in this dance studio and she was in this modern dance class and they started picking music that was not music, but the moves, the choreography was, pretty sexualized. I mean, what is my choice here as a parent? I mean, I've signed her up for the classes. There's a spring or summer recital, and the teacher is going to pick the dance and the outfit. And as parents, we don't have a lot of say so in the music, the choreography, the outfit. And so, what am I going to do? Am I going to pull my child out of that class so that they don't do this particular dance? And I also feel like when you're taking your kids at that age to dance, maybe you're less um, struck by what they're doing because you've signed them up for this dance class. And I really tried to think about, okay, so, my daughter did gymnastics for many years and they wear little leotards and they're running around and, things like that. But it never seemed to raise an eyebrow for me. Now, is that because that's what I signed her up for and that's what I expected? And it never bothered me that it wasn't like she was wearing leggings under her little leotard, but it never occurred to me that could that be seen as being inappropriate. And so I don't know what is causing that change in me. We did a lot of sports as well, and so everything that really was done was either music, sports, voice. It wasn't anything that could be misconstrued in a way that I think dance is, could be done. Though I saw lots of ballet, and none of the ballet performances seemed outside of propriety. It really was more like, wow, these are some really hard moves, and how are people able to do that athletically? So that's what really raised my thoughts when I was watching those performances. But since your children do sports, Alyssa, do you feel like there is some comfort within sports that really, when you have kids younger, that it's really not boy and girl, and it's hard to bring any kind of gender into that or sexuality? Or do you think that dance is sort of a separate animal all to itself? Or do you think that we maybe missed out on a lot of that because we were so, my family was, as well as yours are now, very sports focused? Do you think it's the sport versus dance, or do you think it's something else that contributes to that?
I think I mean, I can only, again, speak from my experience. So, in the sports realm, although my daughter did do gymnastics and she did a little bit of dance, but I mean, the dance class was all little girls and it was ballet. And so, it's pretty formal in that regard. Gymnastics was mixed. Most of the activities under the age of, I'm going to say 5, 6, were like co ed. And so, again, you kind of, there wasn't any delineation of, boys versus girls, or this is a girl sport or this is a boy sport. Like, I remember my daughter had done like an all sports group where they met every week and did a different sport. And I thought that was so neat because I mean, they did everything from hockey to football to basketball to soccer. And there wasn't, again, any delineation of like, oh, this is girl versus boy sports. It was just kind of a global sports thing. So, we had that. But now she's on a traveling softball team and it's all girls. But again, it's really it's not distinguished as far as, being like one a gender versus another or sex. I mean, there's really no sexualized piece to it. So I don't see that as much in that. And so I think that sometimes dance, because it is expressive, it can venture into kind of that realm. So I think that that's probably part of it. I mean, I think that there's probably, again, other things too, that, kind of encompass that. And I think that it really, I'm off the top of my head, that's the only one I can think of that, yeah, that would definitely have that, potential aspect of it. But from my experience, I haven't really seen that. It's kind of been this like kind of global, try everything, see what's kind of sticks as far as like, their interests. And I kind of go with my kids' uh, preference. So I kind of follow them, and each season we just go through the park district, and I say, what do you want to play? And that's how we, lead them into it. I don't say, oh no, you can't do that because that's for girls or boys or that sort of thing.
The other thing I was thinking about while you were talking is that, we had our summer festival here in the city, and I was working on one of the volunteer teams there. And the one of the things that I also noticed, just because I think this is on my mind, because we knew this was going to be a topic we were going to talk about, was I saw that cheerleaders, or the cheer team, what was called the drill team when I was in high school, like that starts really young. And there was a performance, and it from, I think they were probably 7 to 9 or 10 years old. And so I almost feel like, girls who started doing dance as a young child, whether it was ballet or contemporary or hip hop or tap or whatever it was, like it's not a far stretch that then they would get into a cheer team. And so they did a performance in the evening, and it reminded me more of the vein of contemporary dance, where sort of the cheerleaders, the way that they're dressed, the way that they're made up, and the way that they move, reminded me of sort of like, well, this is sort of the trajectory for these children, I almost feel like. And so, once again, I don't think that anybody thinks anything bad of it. I mean, I think if you're families that do this kind of dance, I mean, it is an art form in many, many ways. And so it would be interesting to hear from some dance parents, to see what they say about, our conversation about this. Though, we don't want it to just limit it to their choice of dance or not dance, because we've talked multiple times on this podcast about the fact that, as you're raising children, you have to look at social media, and when do you introduce or allow your children to have, tablet time, or how much access they have to the parent's phone, YouTube, let alone TikTok, Instagram, and some of those other things. And so, but as we were trying to delineate, I mean, there are things that we can control, and then there are things that we can't control as parents. And we have talked about being intentional about exposing our children to social media, and how that happens, and how long you can do that for, before your kids get to an age where, maybe it would be socially awkward for them not to have social media. Even though I have to say, I was listening to another podcast, sort of a celebrity podcast, and these celebrity parents were saying that their kids are 13, 14 years old, and they do not allow their children to be on social media. Like, they have very, very limited exposure. And, as a parent who has now lived through having kids go through junior high school and high school, I thought that would be nearly impossible. My bias is that, is is a child going to feel left out if they don't have conversations around social media? And this is something that these celebrities we're talking about. And maybe for them it's different because they could be in social media because of the celebrity news and sort of how their lives are really not their own with the paparazzi and stuff like that. But I thought it was really interesting that they said, nope, don't let my kids have it. It's very clear that they don't really have a choice in the matter, the children don't. And then because the parents, even though they may no longer be married, agree that social media is not good for their children and for their development, that they really prohibit it or limit it. So that was sort of surprising to me when I was hearing that podcast. And I know, Alyssa, you're definitely the parent who says you're going to hold out as long as you can. Not to say that that I know what that age is, but are you surprised by the celebrities and what they sort of said, or is that sort of what your plan is, and so that fits for what you're thinking?
I think I align with that. I think that I'm pretty close to like I mean it makes sense. I think that especially in the celebrity realm, I think that the fact that so much negativity is out there in social media and with, people twisting the truth and things like that. And so I think that I would definitely stand behind the idea of not creating social media for the kids and keeping them off of that, because I think that a lot of that negativity kind of seeps in, and we see that in cyberbullying and things like that. And so I definitely think that that is part of it. But at the same time, it is really hard to kind of keep them off completely. I've seen some parents go on the opposite spectrum and they say that they've created social media accounts for their kids where they post pictures of them as they're growing up, so that when they come of age, if you will, they'll have an entire profile with memories from when they were kids. And I was like, well, that's really like a sweet concept, but also it's out there on the internet and that's scary. So I think I still feel conflicted. I definitely am on the fence about that, but I think I'm going to hold off as long as possible, because I don't want those influences to occur for my children without them fully understanding what that means and what it means to put something out on the internet, because once it's out there you can't get it back, and it's so permanent in that way. And so I really want to make sure that they're fully educated and that they're not just kind of thrown into something and then being like, oh, my nightmare is like having one of my kids be like, Mom, I put this out on social media and I'm really sorry. And all the things that come with that. Like, I want them to be like really conscientious of what that means and how that plays out and kind of going from there.
Yeah. And I will say that, now looking back at it, I think a lot of negative situations that occurred during middle school and high school could have been avoided if social media was not as big of a part as the lives of these students. I mean, just thinking of like inappropriate pictures that friends shared, definitely the cyberbullying that you mentioned, even kids out of high school in college that might be exploring sexuality for the first time and sharing pictures with their significant other, boyfriend, whatever, and then it coming back to hurt them in the future. And so it makes me think about the fact that even kids who are 18 plus don't understand the realities of social media. How would we then expect young kids to understand the realities? And so I think that that in itself is like a cautionary tale for how much exposure that you should allow young kids, because it doesn't really seem real. Yeah, I think we've talked about this before, like it's almost like they're in a video game or they're in the meta universe or whatever they call that. And it doesn't actually feel real until the consequences hit them. And then they feel very embarrassed and ashamed, and they realize for the first time that they can't get it back. And I know that as many conversations as I've had over the years about the fact that you should be careful what you post, I don't know if it necessarily sunk in the way I wanted it to at the time that I was having those conversations. So it is a pretty dangerous thing. And I do feel like I agree with you, Alyssa. I think that going back and looking at it, maybe I should have been more limiting than I was, just because I don't think I was as sophisticated about social media as my child was. And so, therefore, you have to sort of outpace your kids. And I think that's a very important thing to recognize with kids that of your age. I do think you need to stay ahead of them because I don't think I did. And so, therefore, I wasn't really, I think, aware of everything that there was access to. So it can be a little dangerous for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's really that probably could be a whole nother episode too, because I think that like there's just in the legal system, there's just so many things that happen that it's like that could have been prevented if kids sending things they shouldn't be sending or posting things they shouldn't be posting. And so I think that highly influenced me to be more stringent about that piece of it. But it's also funny because kind of going full circle back to what we were discussing at the beginning is like, are we uh you know trying to shield our children from the world, and then like the world's still going to hit them in some way or shape or form. So I think that it's kind of this balance of giving them exposure, making sure that they're not just completely living in a vacuum, but also making sure so that they're not unduly influenced. So it's this I don't know if I've quite found the balance. Again, I try to monitor like what the media they're getting. But I mean, I still sometimes my son comes up with something and I'm like, where did you hear that? And he's like, I heard on the television show. I'm like, what TV show is this? And, kind of trace it back to see where like he got it. And, it might have been a very benign comment, but he interpreted it a different way. And so I think that at the end of the day, we can't really overly influence our kids, but we can definitely try to manage it the best way that we can and hope for the best.
And one final thought that I was having, because I was feeling like, oh, I think we've really, talked about this in many ways, and is there a lot more to say? But the one thing I will comment on is I think that the one thing that my child and children understand is that, there are certain things that are a privilege. And if you respect the privilege, you get more privilege. And if you take advantage of the privilege, then you lose the privilege. And so I think that that's like a good rule of thumb for even when it comes to social media or other privileges that you give your children, because they earn freedom because they earn your respect or, your trust as a parent. And they need to realize that they really are in control of how much trust and how much respect they get from you based on their use of that trust. And I mean, I think that is the one thing I think is really clear. And I don't think that kids understand, as we all know, because we've all lived through this age ourselves, that it takes a lifetime to create trust with your parents and it takes minutes to lose it and to go back so far behind. And so, but I do think that that's something that if you teach your kids to understand, that I think is easier to understand than maybe some complicated explanation of the dangers of social media or something like that. So hopefully that lands. I don't know if, I mean, I don't know how you think about that, Alyssa, but that was sort of my parting thought because I thought, you know what, maybe you can just, it's because I think you have to repeat things over and over and over again to kids. And if you're trying to teach them a lesson, I think understanding how trust works between parents and children is something that, I think we established early on, and we can just continue expanding that concept as they get older and more mature and more able to understand more complex ideas. Any thoughts on that before we wrap it up?
Yeah, no, I agree completely with that. And I think that that's probably, I mean, again, at the end of the day, we're trying to do the best that we can. And there is just so much out there that we really can't control. So we can try to control the media that's coming in. We can try to limit their, you know, TV time, excuse me, tablet time or screen time. That's what I was trying to think of. We can try to limit as best we can, but at the end of the day, it really is all about like having the tools and them having the skill set to problem solve and say, maybe this is not a good idea. And to trust, like you said, to have that trust between the relationship so that they can talk about that and we can kind of have that conversation. So I think we've, like you said, covered quite a bit of ground here, and we might have some offshoots, but we always welcome our listeners to kind of chime in as well and let us know what you're thinking about, how this sat with you, maybe some things that you've had influence you, and kind of go from there.
Sounds good. So we're signing off. This is Alyssa Marie and Joji, the Deconstructed Woman. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Deconstructed Woman. If you liked this podcast, please share it with your friends, rate this episode, or subscribe to be notified of all new content. We want to hear from you, our listener. Do you have thoughts on the discussions we're having? Want to share topic suggestions? Or want to join us for a topic that you're passionate about? Contact us at our email address, thedeconstructedwoman@gmail.com.